Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first lecture of this week, which is going to be focusing on the charm circle. Sorry, that was rude. The Charm Circle was written by Gail Rubin in the 1980s, and Gail Rubin is very well known both within the field of anthropology, women's studies, as well as LGBTQ studies. Rubin was some of the first anthropologists who were actually doing research within the LGBT community. Specifically, Rubin was looking at the BDSM leather community in San Francisco and writing really interesting um, oral histories and ethnographies on the scene. And her work is very much fundamental in pushing theorists and scholars, both within women's studies, anthropology, LGBT studies, in critically looking at sex and sexuality and how we look at social structures. And very much her work also was meant to make it very important interventions into the field of women's studies by talking about and directly confronting some of the very negative as well as very adamant anti-sex stance that many feminist theorists and activists at the time were having. And so her work, as well as her activism, and then just as well as her as a person, was very much about disrupting anti-sex, anti-porn, anti-erotic, and feminist theorizing. So, just to give a little bit of context to what Rubin is talking about in this piece, during the time of the 1980s and coming from the 70s and 80s during what would be classified as the second wave of the feminist movement, there was a very much harsh stance around not only sex work, but also around any sort of sexualization of women. And understandably, their stance came out of having to really sort of confront sexist, misogynistic attitudes. It was the second wave that was really talking about for the first time ever in real, adamant, activism around sexual harassment, which again was a term that just wasn't really used. Doesn't mean that it didn't exist, but it wasn't really used and actually being saying that we need to have laws that protect women from these sort of discriminations. And that also that, as many of you who are women's studies students know about just the continued sexual objectification of women, both within media and everyday life, as well. And for many feminists at the time, and even still to this day, see the sexual exploitation and objectification of women as leading to the dominance and the sort of violence towards women, because there is a natural arc, right? Because when you objectify women's bodies, you see them as only sex objects, not as subjects, then therefore then it's not just about overly eroticizing women, it is also about making them objects, making them property, and therefore then you have this sort of idea of power over women, and that it leads to rape culture, sexual violence against women, discrimination, and the gender hierarchy, as well as feminists from this time period and still to this day have taken on, some feminists have taken on this very much anti sex work, that all sex work is exploitative in the sense that women are having to, and not only women are sex workers, of course, but usually in this argument they're talking about female sex workers, that female sex workers are exploited, even if they themselves control the transaction, the money, they have full control over what they will engage in and who they engage with. Many feminists see this still as very much exploitative, that these women have to or need to sell sex, and that men, using their infinite resources, power, and so forth that they've gotten, because there still is a gender hierarchy and men are still very much overall privileged, both, in society, but also economically, that they can then buy sex from women. So there has been and there continues to be a very much strong stance on anti-sex within the feminist movement, and it does come from a very important and very much legitimate argument around the sexual exploitation of women and how that leads to the continued sort of patriarchal violence and domination against women and the gender hierarchy. So, it's not to say that when I'm talking about that, Gail Rubin's criticism around feminists being anti-sex, that it's necessarily that they're completely wrong on their arguments, because I think a lot of their arguments make a lot of sense, but at the same time, as we're going to talk about more, these sort of very stringent stances, on anti-pornography, that all pornography is violence against women, regardless of not if the woman engaging in pornography is consenting, wants to do it, willing, able, happy, right? It's still exploitive. To any sort of eroticization of women, whether they themselves choose to want to do it themselves. To also, that then leads to other things such as anti-kink, so any sort of kink, BDSM, any sort of thing like that is seen as still very much a violence against women and exploitive, as well as very much anti-sex work. And the reason why I said, in the last slide about, feminists in the 70s and 80s having this very much, mainstream feminists, I should say, having a very anti-sex stance, to say that, that also many feminists today still have that, because the argument is not settled, right, on the stance around pornography or sex work, and that's really important. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of times, these issues, particularly around pornography, sex work, is not so black and white, and that there are a lot of power differentials in this. So, for example, kind of what we would consider pop celebrity feminists, like Lena Dunham, has criticized organizations like Amnesty International, which has changed their policies from supporting the criminalization of sex work to decriminalizing sex work entirely. And Lena Dunham has criticized that as, that it's basically, by decriminalizing sex work, you're siding with the men, mostly, who have power over the situation, and you're basically siding with the Johns, which is a slang term for customers of sex workers, and that you're not actually going to help these women, and again, always framing the sex worker as a woman, which there's many sex workers who are male-bodied, transgender, again, but in this debate, oftentimes sex worker is gendered as being a cisgendered woman. And she, as well as many other pop celebrity feminists like Meryl Streep, Kate Winslet, and Hathaway, have urged, for the continued criminalization of sex workers, and that that by decriminalizing sex work, you will adopt a policy that sides with buyers of sex, pimps, and other exploiters, rather than with the exploited. The thing is with this, and what gets to Gail Rubin's sort of critique, and more as we talk about it, is that as much as we can say, yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that by decriminalizing sex workers are going to be safe and protected. We still live in a world where there's incredible amounts of violence, particularly violence against women, trans people, other sexual minorities, gay men, and so forth. So that doesn't necessarily mean that, decriminalization leads to protection. But at the same time, and Gail Rubin has made this critique, as well as many other feminists have made this critique, that that as much as you might feel one way or the other around sex work, why aren't you listening to sex workers themselves? Because sex workers who are activists and talking publicly about their field and their profession and so forth have pretty much all around have sort of stated that they do want decriminalization, because decriminalization um, means that, that sex workers can have legal access to police protection and so forth, because using the criminal law to control sex work means that police are pitted against sex workers, and sex workers can pay the price with their lives. Sex workers who are also migrants, transgender, and or people of color or ethnic minorities are intensely subjected to this sort of kind of criminalization and exclusion. And so sex workers overall, and there's been this really robust sex workers' rights movement. One, as I show you this picture right here, the Red Umbrella Campaign, which is a very much a unified international campaign by sex workers for decriminalization, protection, and resources for sex workers. All of whom who support the decriminalization of sex work in a stance, and that sex workers' own rights have stated that criminal laws only add to challenges, poverty, marginalization, access to health care that many sex workers already face. But it's still a sort of a debate that's going on, and it's not that it's black or, that it is very murky and gray in many instances, but the reason why I'm giving you this example of sex work and the debates going on today is just to say that, one, that it's not settled on how mainstream feminism approaches issues around sex, particularly around sex work, pornography, but also that there is still a lot of anti-sex sentiment, and by anti-sex I'm referring to anti-pornography, anti-sex work, anti-kink within the mainstream feminist movement. This is where Gayle Rubin comes back into this, and especially how she has contributed to the idea of a sex positive feminism. So she writes that there's been, two strains of thoughts within the feminist movement. There's been the one strain that I've talked about before, which has this tendency to consider any sexual liberalization, any sort of sexual, freedom, expression, and so forth, to be inherently a mere extension of male privilege. That maybe women want to feel sexy or distribute or express sexiness or so forth, or want to engage in sex or sex work, and instead, has and instead of sort of seeing this as sort of a freedom for women to choose what they want to do with their bodies, instead seen as like, well, actually, as much as you think that you're in control of your own eroticism, it's still an extension of male privilege and male consumption and power over you. And that tradition, which I talked about, is very much resonates with this sort of conservative anti-sexual discourse. But Rubin also says that there's also this other strand, which is around sex-positive feminism, which has been to criticize the restrictions on women's sexual behavior. And instead, so criticize, again, the way that women are sexually exploited, which the other group does as well. But instead of saying that then all sex is bad, all sort of sexual expression is bad, instead saying that, instead we're directing our anger at the wrong object. Instead of getting mad at women for wanting to be sexy, instead we should denounce the fact that there's these high costs placed on women for wanting to be sexually active, to wanting to be sexually expressive. That really, what are we angry about is not that women are sexually expressive, again, that's not the problem. In fact, should be encouraged is the fact that women are often damned if they do, damned if they don't. So, and that that women are oftentimes, when they want to be sexually empowered, are condemned, both by men and society, but also by other feminists, and that in itself is wrong. So with sex positive feminism, there's this idea, and it's coming from the 80s, right during the time that Gayle Rubin is talking and writing about it, is that sexual freedom is an essential component of women's freedom. And far too long, the feminist movement, what sex positive feminists have argued, that far too long the feminist movement has ignored sexualities. It has ignored sexual expression, desire, freedom, wants, and so forth. And that women having the ability to have that, to also not have to also not only have that, but to also be empowered, protected, secured to be able to express and show and engage in their sexuality without the consequences, without having to experience objectification, violence, homophobia, misogyny, and so forth. And as a sex positive feminist, then, critiquing any sort of legal or social efforts to control sexual activities between consenting adults, to control women's own authority over their eroticism. And with that, also then, very much being inclusive to sexual minority rights. That it's not that women's rights are also sexual minority rights, because many women are sexual minorities, right? But also that, sexual freedom is inherently part of the women's rights movement that applies to everyone. And endorsing the value of coalition building between groups, especially within LGBT communities. And also, very much critiquing feminists, within the second wave, but even still today, around the sort of instant black and white sort of characterizations around sex, that women are above sex, or that they're sexless, and men are sexual predators, that they're just horn dogs and they want sex all the time, and that they not only want sex all the time, but they're predatory and they could be harmful and so forth. And instead, sex positive feminists have said, well, that in itself is wrong, right? And that we shouldn't be vilifying men and male sexuality as being inherently always evil. We can definitely critique and go after the power structures that have made it so that women are sexually exploited, sexual violence occurs a lot towards women, and so forth. But when we sort of say that all men are predators, we are basically repeating a lot of the same sort of arguments that won't work to actually fight against, the discrimination and the violence that happens towards women. Making all men be seen as the bad guys doesn't actually help anybody. And instead, they talk about that men aren't always predators and shouldn't be always put into predatory thing, sort of category, but also that, we should also look at the way that we think about sexuality. Is this, it's not just male sexuality versus female sexuality, but instead let's embrace a whole range of human sexuality and human expression that goes beyond the gender binary. This then gets into Rubin's contribution to both within feminism, women's studies, as well as with queer studies. Now, a lot of what she's saying does actually mirror what we were talking about last week, in the sense that she talks about how sexuality is constituted in society and history, not biologically ordained. Sex, sexuality, the way that we think about them is always through the prism of culture, right? And that you can't sort of say that it comes biologically. And in that, then, she talks about Western culture and how Western culture has had this sort of tradition around seeing sex, because a lot of the influence of Christianity, to be dangerous, destructive, a negative force, right? It all comes down to Eve and the apple, essentially, which not only condemns women, but condemns all sex, right? And therefore, then, Western culture has always treated sex with some form of suspicion. And that, with that then, but yet, people still need to have sex, especially if you want to have a child. We then sort of create a hierarchy around, okay, if all sex is actually bad, then we have to sort of create a hierarchy of like, okay, if we're going to engage in sex, then this is the sex we should be having, because this is the holy, sanctified, or good sex. And anything, further down, then that's sinful, bad, deviant sex that we shouldn't be having. And that popular culture today still is very much permeated with ideas that erotic variety, sexual desire, sex in itself, sex acts, sexuality, and so forth is very dangerous and can be very unhealthy and depraved, and even a threat or a menace to everything from the sanctity and safety of our children to our national security. This is where Rubin starts talking about that in Western society there is a sexual sort of hierarchy. The need to sort of again and the reason why the sexual hierarchy exists is sort of this need to draw and maintain an imaginary line between what is good and what is bad sex. Only sex acts on the good side of the line are accorded, sort of moral attributes. For instance, heterosexual encounters may be sublime or disgusting, free or forced, healing or destructive, romantic or not. As long as it does not violate other rules, heterosexuality is acknowledged to exhibit the full range of human experience. In contrast, all sex acts on the bad side of the line are considered utterly repulsive, right? Devoid of all, are seen as unnatural, sinful, sick, deviant, abnormal. And the further from the line a sex act is, the more it is depicted as uniformly dangerous, bad, and so forth. Most of the discourses on sex, be they religious, psychiatric, popular culture, political, delimit a very small portion of human sexual activity as being safe, healthy, mature, legal, or politically correct. So if you see on this sort of slope, you have what is good sex, which again is seen as normal, natural, healthy, and holy, right? Heterosexual, but not only just heterosexual, but you're married, and then you're also monogamous, meaning just two people together. And also, sex is about, it's not just about having fun, but it should be about reproductive, right? You're going to have sex to have a baby. And always have it at home. And, you can even add more caveats to this, that it's not only at home, but it should be in your bedroom and not on the kitchen floor, right? And then, when you go down the line, there's a little gray area, right? Where it's not fully good, it's not fully bad, but it's in this gray area where you have, sex with unmarried heterosexual couples, promiscuous heterosexuals, people who are not monogamous fully and, maybe have multiple different partners but are married, masturbation, right? Solo sex, right? Long-term, stable lesbian and gay male couples are kind of in this gray area. Promiscuous gay men in the baths or the park are in that area. And then as you go further down, you have then seen as like very threatening sex, right? Bad sex, abnormal, unnatural, sick, sinful, way out. And now the terms that she's using, again, this is a piece that was written in the 80s. She's using words that we wouldn't use today, like transvestites, transsexuals. But I think these terms are still, the sort of idea around people who cross gender binaries as being dangerous, having sex with those people, or those people having sex with each other or with other people as bad and sinful, to people who maybe want to engage in sex play, kink, BDSM, sex work. Cross-generational refers to older, younger people having sex with each other, and so forth. And within our society, so we have this sort of slope, right? You could also even think of it like a domino theory, in the sense that, you have one that's really sort of, the top, and then and it goes further down. And always within society, we have these arguments that are then conducted over where to draw the line. Where is where good sex ends to where bad sex ends, And that shifts with time. So think about this kind of hierarchy, or slippery slope is another way to think about it. Think about gay marriage. Now, I know for many of you, you were rather you were in high school or younger when gay marriage was passed, and so it seems like a very distant memory. I remember very much the debates around gay marriage, uh, especially growing, in high school and so forth. And of course, there were a lot of arguments around that very much mirrored Gail Rubin's sort of slope in the sense of that, you had one side, pro gay marriage, saying that we're just like you, we come from loving, healthy families, we want to share our love for each other, marriage is about love. And then you had total D-bags like Rick Santorum saying stuff like, regardless or not that you want to get married, because you love each other, if we allow gay marriage, this could lead to a slippery slope. And there was always then this argument like, if we pass gay marriage, what's next? What is it? People are going to marry their cats? And so I have a cat. I have two cats actually. And I've always found that argument very funny because one is obscene. Like, first of all, and it's also incredibly offensive because basically Rick Santorum, and he wasn't the only one. There were many others who would equate that. Like, you just marry a dog? What are we going to have? Man on dog marriage love, right? Basically equating two consenting gay couple, gay persons getting married as the same as this lesbian in her picture marrying her cat, who's clearly not really wanting to be involved in this marriage. Right? So, but this slippery slope thing was used as a way to talk about, well, what is acceptable? So we're going to accept gay marriage now. That's good. Well, then what's next? And this idea again of this almost like a domino game that we allow one thing to happen, then all of moral society, our moral fabric will collide. And the thing is that, yes, we have gay marriage. And yes, you could say, in comparison to when I was in high school hearing these debates, that there's a lot more social acceptance around gay marriage. One, because it mirrors a lot of, what we consider, again, thinking back to that hierarchy of good, holy, sanctified sex, right? Two monogamous couples, two monogamous people getting married. Oftentimes they want to start a family and so forth. So we might have accepted it being two gay couples or two gay persons getting married, but there's still an incredible amount of moral panic as well as disapproval of this, as we can see just recently. The Supreme Court sides with the baker who turned away a couple from his bakery on the basis of religious grounds, stating that it would violate his religious freedom because he does not support their union. So that's just to say that, one, that this slippery slope argument is not going away anytime soon, and that also that gay marriage is, even though it has been accepted, doesn't mean that it is fully, even though it's gotten the legal acceptance, doesn't mean that it's actually been socially accepted. I think another sort of example recently that we can think about in regards to this slippery slope and the way that we've created a hierarchy around sex is also the way that the debate around the bathroom bills have been around. Basically, these laws that have happened in Texas and South Carolina and Arizona and other places that have banned individuals, transgender individuals, from using the bathroom of their preference, the bathroom that they feel the most comfortable with, right? Instead, you have to be in the bathroom that is assigned to you biologically from birth, which is again incredibly offensive. And a lot of the debates around that, particularly people who support the bathroom bill, is about that. Well, if we allow transgender people to use the bathroom of their choice, then that could open up the door for sexual perverts from coming in to, prey upon our children. Again, equating transgender people to sexual perverts, there you have that right there. But also that, again, this idea of a slippery slope, that if we allow a very small minority of the population, really, to be comfortable and pee, have that human dignity to pee where they need to, where they feel the best, that can open up the door for, I guess, a horde of gross, perverted sexual predators to come in to watch us go to the bathroom. Again, this slippery slope. Even though evidence has shown, one, that, first of all, nobody has been sexually preyed upon or attacked by a transgender person in a bathroom. Like, none of that scenario is there. But then also that transgender people are not sexual predators, right? Again, and in fact, the people who experience the most amount of violence when using a public restroom is transgender people from cisgender people attacking them because either they don't look the right part or whatever somebody assumes, and then verbally attacks them, or worse, or just refuses them admittance and the dignity to go to the bathroom, which is a human right. So all this goes into saying, what is Rubin talking about here is around a sexual hierarchy, where, again, at the top, you have cisgender heterosexual relationships, right? And then, of course, at the bottom, you have non-cisgender, transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, as well as non-heterosexual, homosexual, pansexual, bisexual, being at the bottom. But it's also important that it's not just cisgender and heterosexual is at the top, but also all these other factors, right? That we saw in that slide, in the sense of, they not only have to be cisgender and heterosexual, they have to be monogamous, child producing, no sex outside of marriage. Also, even more specifics, they're not using any toys, sex toys. They're not using any role play. They're not doing any sort of kinky activities. No public sex, so sex only in the home. And no sort of gender role reversals, both within the bedroom but also outside of the bedroom, right? So maintaining the strict gender binary as well as the gender hierarchy within these relationships. This gets into the charm circle, which Rubin presents as a way to talk about how sex has been regulated or evaluated within our society. And according to the charm circle, sexuality that is good and normal and natural should be heterosexual, marital, meaning married, monogamous, reproductive, you're going to have a kid, and non-commercial, meaning no sex work. It should be coupled, meaning that, again, you're in a monogamous relationship, relational, within the same generation, so no sort of differences in age, and occur at home. It should not involve pornography, fetish objects, sex toys of any sort, or roles other than male and female. Again, maintaining that gender binary. Any sex that violates these really stringent rules is seen as therefore bad, abnormal, unnatural, dangerous, and worse. Bad sex may be homosexual, unmarried, promiscuous, non-procreative, or commercial. It may be masturbatory, or take place at orgies, may be casual, may cross generational lines, and may take place in public, or at least in the bushes or in the bathhouses. It may involve the use of pornography, fetish objects, sex toys, or unusual roles. So in this charm circle, as you can see, the center is, again, the sort of things that we value as good sex. Anything outside of it, we consider it bad sex. We consider it dangerous and so forth. And these have real consequences because it's not just only a popular opinion on how we think about, well, what is the sex that you should be having, the holy sex, the sanctified sex, the socially appropriate sex, but also we as a society have regulated sex in a way to maintain this charm circle. So when we're talking about the regulation of sex, it's really important to talk about that there is this sort of, again, charmed idea around the single notion of sex, that that good sex, again, is within that little limited framework, and anything outside of it is abnormal or even can lead to even worse things. And therefore then our state, our society, whether that's our individual states like the state of Indiana to federal, regulation, has done a lot to regulate sex in order to maintain that charm circle. For example, sex laws, which you're going to be exploring in your discussion. Sex laws is sort of the most adamant instrument of sexual stratification and erotic persecution. The state routinely intervenes in sexual behavior at a level that would not be tolerated in other areas of social life. And, most people are actually unaware of the extent of sex law. Like, for example, I bet a lot of people in Indiana do not know that oral sex is illegal, right? Because then then the local jails would be filled with people by now, right? But the fact that they're still on the books speaks to, again, this idea of the state intervening, trying to regulate and maintain this idea that, sex, even something as simple as like the kinds of sex you have, whether that is penetrative sex, and again, there was, not too long ago, there were laws banning sodomy, right? So, these laws were put into practice to regulate, control, discipline, and criminalize same-sex, particularly male same-sex sexual activity. But sodomy also applied to heterosexual couples as well. And though that was not enforced as much as it was towards gay male partners engaging in sodomy. And again, most people are unaware of the extent of sex law, the quantity and qualities of illegal sexual behavior, as well as the sort of the punitive character on these legal sanctions. And although federal agencies may be involved in the creation of sex laws, most sex laws are enacted at the state and city level, municipal level, and enforcement is in the hands of local police. Therefore, there is a lot of discrepancy and a lot of variation in how much sex laws are enforced, given the locale. And sex laws, criminalize sexual behavior that is freely chosen and avidly sought. The ideology, again, embodies this idea of a sexual hierarchy that, that is that some sex acts are considered to be so bad or intrinsically vile that no one should be allowed under any circumstance to perform them. The fact that individuals consent or even prefer them is taken to be additional evidence of their depravity or their sickness. This system of sex law is similar to legalized racism. State prohibition of same-sex contact, anal penetration, and oral sex make, people who engage in these sex acts a criminal group, denied the privileges of full citizenship. With such laws, prosecution is persecution, even when they are not strictly enforced, as is usually the case. Again, a lot of these sex laws aren't enforced, but the members of criminalized sexual communities particularly who are targeted by these sex laws. For example, the banning of sodomy. The sodomy laws were very much about targeting homosexuals, right? It allows them, to criminalize sexual communities and remain vulnerable to the possibility of arrest or periods in which they become the objects of social panic. And when those occur, the laws are in place and police action is swift. Even sporadic enforcement on these sort of bizarre sex laws serves to remind individuals that they are members of a marginalized population. The occasional arrest for when there were anti-sodomy laws, sodomy laws, to lewd behavior, solicitation, or oral sex keeps everyone else afraid, nervous, and marginalized. So, sex laws is just one example. And again, one of the things about sex laws is that because they are sporadically enforced, they are also kind of dangerous in the sense that they maintain, it's really up to the police officer to decide if they're going to arrest you for this. Prostitution laws, again, are also there to maintain the charm circle, right? Where commercial sex is considered to be depraved, disgusting, unlawful. And therefore, then, by criminalizing the sex worker, you're putting that person into a very vulnerable situation where they cannot even seek police protection when they do experience violence, assault, and so forth. Obscenity laws are another way of regulation of sex and maintaining the charm circle. So, obscenity laws can range from, obscenity laws around swearing in public, which there are actually several obscenity laws on the books in Indiana, where it's, one is there is a law so that it is actually illegal to take the Lord's name in vain. Again, if this was actually really fully enforced enforced by the full capacity of the law, the jailhouses would be filled. But again, it's not, but it maintains this idea of what is actually good, proper behavior, not taking the Lord's name in vain. But there are other obscenity laws, and these laws can be, in some ways, even more dangerous than the criminalization laws around sex, because it's really up to the discretion of the police officer to determine if you are being obscene or not. So, prior to the banning of gay marriage and so forth, LGBT persons could be arrested for holding hands, kissing in public, showing too much affection, because it was considered obscene, and they would be arrested just for that. So not even engaging in public sex, which that itself was criminalized and still is criminalized in many places, but just the mere sort of thing of holding hands, they would spend a night in jail for that. And while, obscenity laws have reduced in sort of the power that they've had, they're still present. A couple years back, there was a lesbian couple who were just kissing, right? Being a couple, making out, whatever, on a public park bench, and they were arrested. And I believe that was in the state of Illinois, again, under that city's obscenity laws, being that they are being too obscene. So these laws do exist. And in fact, I think that just like sex laws, they can be just as dangerous or even more dangerous than the outright, criminalization of same-sex sexual activity or whatever, because they're left so much to the discretion of the police officer to decide whether you are being obscene or not. And of course, so those are just the laws and how they're used to regulate and maintain that charm circle. There are many other ways, right? Medicine, psychiatry has used that, talking about sex addicts, right? That people who enjoy having sex with multiple people or have, kinky sex or whatever sex are seen as having a disease or so forth. And, medicine and psychiatry has a very long history of, you know, falsely putting people into categories of being mentally unwell or ill because they don't fit within the sexual hierarchy and the gender hierarchy. Lesbian and gays were one time classified as a mental illness. They are no longer. Transgender people are still within the DSM-5 medical psychiatric handbook, though that has been challenged and changed, and hopefully will further be challenged. Education, right? And we're going to talk a little bit in the next slide about this, but education has been a really important way of regulating what is the proper way to behave and what is not the proper way to behave. Media, of course, right? News reports, moral panics over people having too much sex or not having sex the right way and so forth. Like these sort of moral sort of panics, parents, worried about their children. It's something that is repeated pretty much every 5 months, right? It's just a continuation. And in that, it helps maintain the charm circle, as well as popular discourse. So discourse refers to, again, how we think and communicate about people, things, the social organization of society, and the relationships among and between all three. Discourse typically emerges out of social institutions like media and politics, but very much it's about how we discuss and how we frame certain issues. So the way that we talk, read, interact with one another. And that has been very much a huge force in the regulation of sex and maintaining, again, this charm circle where we have this idea, we're all taught this idea of what sex should be and what is good sex, and then also seen as, kind of fearful or condemned or ashamed when we step outside of that very tiny little narrow inner circle. As I mentioned before, education has worked very diligently on maintaining that charm circle. And a great way to think about it is around sex education. As Gayle Rubin has said in her piece, if sex is taken too seriously, which she says it does, then sexual persecution is not taken seriously enough. That the persecution against those who are willingly engaging in consensual sex is not seen as a big deal speaks again to the way that we as society have always deemed sex to be dangerous and negative. And we see this in the way that we teach sex today to our youth. Because what we do oftentimes in sex education is maintain a sexual hierarchy. In the sense of that, if you're going to engage in sex, this is the only type of sex that you should be having, and you should actually probably should wait towards marriage anyways, and etc. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So here's the thing. When we talk about sex education here in the United States, it is a mess. A big mess. So sex education, it's also called, health education, right? Is supposed to cover a whole range of information, right? Not only around if you have a program, if you have a school that actually offers discussions around safe sex, but also anatomy, physical, sexual health, so many other aspects. But here's the thing. Because it's not federally regulated and it very much depends on the state to the city, there is a wide discrepancy around the education that you're going to get around sex. Because only 13 states right now have in place legal standards requiring sex ed students to get taught medically accurate information. That is terrifying. And in fact, because there's no sort of oversight over how schools, and these are public schools, I'm not even talking about private schools, are teaching sex ed, sexual health, then what happens is then it becomes a free-for-all for any sort of school district to decide on what they want to teach. And that, the information presented in most sex education seminars and classes has to make it through a gauntlet of upset parents, community advisors, and conservative teachers before getting to young people. And because there are no federal regulations around sex ed, federal money is often used to fund unscientific, inaccurate, and religiously oriented abstinence only education programs. And there is an abundance. There's actually a greater rise in abstinence only education, um, sex education here in the United States, where you have more and more districts going to that. And many of you are probably familiar with abstinence only education, whether you've had to go through it yourself or you've also had other people go through it around you. And with abstinence only education, it's very much maintaining the charm circle, because it's about not having sex is presented as the only real way to prevent pregnancy. If contraceptives and barrier methods are mentioned, their failure rates are often featured prominently. And of course, LGBT sexual orientations, anything around that, are not discussed. But the data shows, like, if sex education is about, stopping teen pregnancy, then abstinence-only education does not make a difference in the behavior of teenagers. Teenagers will have sex regardless or not, but they're now not having proper education around sexual health. And in studies by the CDC and the effects of sexual health education in different communities, comprehensive sex education delayed sexual activity by an average of 18 months, while abstinence-only education had little to no effect on the beginning point of sexual activity. What's more, studies have shown that states that have heavily promoted abstinence-only education have higher teen birth rates overall and higher incidence of STIs and STDs. So abstinence-only education is one way that the charm circle gets reinforced, right? Because the education that you get, or children who undergo abstinence education, is incomplete, one, but also it maintains this idea, it reproduces this idea around that there's only one good way to have sex, right? And therefore it's sex within marriage, children, all of that. And that then, anything outside of that is seen as bad, deviant, and you shouldn't be doing it. And this not only, causes damage to children and as they become young adults and sexually active and so forth, in the sense that they don't learn about and understand and get familiar with sexual health, condoms and so forth. But also it sets in this, you learn about shame, and it also can lead to young adults being very much feeling ashamed to seek advice or seek help if they are engaging in sexual activity, because again, they've already been taught, they've been indoctrinated that there's only one good form of sex and anything outside of it is wrong. But this not only applies to the way that we think about sexual health and so forth, because again, as studies have shown, abstinence-only education does not prevent sexual activity. Sexual activity will continue, if there is a will, there is a way. But also then limits other sort of forms of discussion, because again, if you're not teaching fully comprehensive sex education, then students are often not sort of discussing and learning about consensual relationships. So something that's very fundamental to having a sexually healthy life, consent, is not taught to students. And then therefore then you see, there's no surprise then that, you see students having to feel forced in having sex or experiencing sexual assault, but not feeling afraid to tell authorities because, again, of the shame of the charm circle, right? The shame, not only that you're engaging in sex, but then again, that it's somehow your fault. It maintains this this sexual hierarchy that then causes incredible amounts of violence and damages to occur. But abstinence-only education is just one example of how the charm circle is maintained, right? Through education. We can also talk about not only through education, but also through popular, discourse on the way that we sort of have criminalized, regulated sexual relationships, sexual activities, regardless of their, if it's homosexual, heterosexual, etc., as being again, something that is like either sick, dangerous, or worse, right? The way that BDSM and kink, even though it's become very popular with 50 Shades of Grey for a certain segment of the population, still BDSM and kink is seen uh, as something that is depraved sex acts, dangerous sex acts, something that you should be ashamed of. And oftentimes, people have been criminalized or thrown into jail for engaging in consensual sex. That is under the, very much the culture of BDSM, which very much emphasizes consent. There are other ways that the charm circle gets reinforced as well through laws and the way that we've talked, popular discourse or even education and so forth. Polyamory, which is about people engaging in multiple relationships with other people. And there's different configurations on polyamory, but it's again about consenting individuals engaging in a relationship with one person, with two people, with each other, and so forth. Again, different configurations. And the fact is that a lot of polyamorous relationships are technically could be criminalized under bigamy laws, which shouldn't be applied to polyamorous people because they are consenting adults engaging in a relationships with each other, but also refusal for child adoption, insurance, and so forth. We very much have created a society here in the United States that's based on a monogamous model, right? So if you want your partners to be on your insurance, you can only have one partner, right? Because it's only a spouse. If you want your child to be adopted by, your two significant partners, that's not going to be allowed because it's really only one parent, two parents on one child's birth certificate or so forth. These are just many ways that we have maintained this charm circle that inhibits and disenfranchises and discriminates against a multitude of people. So, just to sum up again, the charm circle refers to the attitudes, beliefs, and practices related to sex that are considered normal and good in the dominant culture. And Rubin uses this idea of the circle, divided into, again, the inner circle, which again is the pure good circle, with different societal values applied to them, to sexual behaviors, right? So monogamous, married, procreative, coupled, right? So it's just two people. Bodies only, so no sex toys and so forth, right? And placing certain behaviors in the innermost good natural portion and certain other behaviors again on the outskirts, seen as bad and so forth. But here's the other thing is that with the charm circle, it does shift. It's not, Gayle Rubin wrote this piece in the 1980s and, wrote this circle in the 1980s, and some things have changed a little bit, and that, what behaviors are seen as good as normal have shifted a little bit. For example, it's a lot more socially accepted for people to engage in sex prior towards marriage or even out, not even having to be married to engage in sex. There's a lot more sort of acceptance or even, sort of praisal, or even now there's like a pressure that you should be sexually active towards marriage, before marriage, or even, not get married and be sexually active, which in itself is like, that's great that there's a lot more social acceptance, but we're still pressuring people either or, and that in itself is wrong. People should have the freedom to do whatever they want with their bodies within the confines of consent, of course, right? Of course, there's, with the charm circle, things may shift, but still, there's a lot of social fear and panic and alarm in trying to maintain a sort of sexual hierarchy. Maybe some of the configurations have changed. Gay marriage in some ends has, made it so that homosexual coupled monogamous relationships are seen, kind of further up or are now seen in the little inner circle. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all accepted. And definitely that doesn't mean that we're now more all around accepted around sexual variety. We can talk about many examples within our culture. For example, there's been a huge uproar in the past couple of years around children and young adults, exchanging sexually explicit photos of each other and having young adults then get arrested for distributing child pornography of themselves, right? And again, it's this idea, and again, we can talk about consent and so forth, but a lot of it is also this idea that children should not be sexual. Again, that I guess when you're 18, then you can be sexual, which is not necessarily the case. And again, we can talk about the gray areas around consent and maturity, but at the very heart of it is still this idea that what we think about is good sex. And a lot of it has to do around age, that we think that you should only be a certain age to engage in sex, but then also you shouldn't be engaging with sex with people that are too older than you or younger than you and so forth. And of course, with the religious tolerance laws that are out there that are meant to protect freedom of speech, which is good, and that are also meant to protect people religious freedom, which is also not bad, but also been used in a way to kind of maintain the charm circle in the sense that, yes, legally we've accepted certain forms of the charm circle. For example, gay marriage has allowed homosexuality, a certain, expression of homosexuality, basically gay married couples, social acceptance. Doesn't also mean that, that the discrimination doesn't still occur and that there's still a hierarchy there to begin with. We're going to explore a lot more of this in our short writing assignment. So you're going to find information on that onto Blackboard. But yeah, so we're going to continue on this conversation and talk about The Compulsory Heterosexuality by Adrienne Rich.